This week, we will be learning how to identify and use key details in a text as evidence to support specific claims and or ideas. We are going to focus primarily on informational texts in the form of historical and science and technical texts. Before we get started practicing the skills, let's take a few moments to identify some key terms and learn specifically what are details and what are the differences between the types of text that we will be using to practice these skills. Let's begin by thinking about why we read on a day-to-day basis. I'm not talking about reading for pure entertainment or just simply because we enjoy reading. I am specifically talking about those times that we have a question that comes to mind or maybe something that we need to know, and what's the first thing that we do? We pull out our cell phones, go to Google, and we search for it. We look for a particular article or some other source online that will help us answer that question that we have or figure out what we are looking for. So in our everyday, day-to-day lives, we are primarily going to read for the purpose of finding information. When you are reading for information, let's be honest, do you read the entire article? Do you read the entire passage? No, you don't. None of us do. Typically, what we are going to do is skim to look for the answer to that particular question. So when we do this, we need to make sure that we are focusing on the details. So when we talk about details, what do we mean? Simply put, details are important pieces of information that we use to support a particular claim or idea. So once again, details are important pieces of information that we use to support a particular claim or idea. The details within a text are what actually helps to give the text meaning. And this is the foundation for reading comprehension. So it gives the text meaning. Another way to think of it is that details are facts. So when we are looking through a passage, reading for information, we are looking specifically for facts. And these facts are going to answer the 5 W's. Who, what, when, where, and of course, why. So whenever we have one of those 5 W questions, we are going to look through the passage for details to help answer those questions specifically. For our purposes, we are typically going to be looking at one of 2 types of text. These texts are known as informational texts and literary texts. So as we look through these, we are going to try to identify what are known as explicit details. And these are details that are specifically stated in the text. And the type of details that we look for are going to differ based on the type of text that we are reading. So let's take a moment and think about the differences between informational texts and literary texts. In an informational text, it serves the purpose to inform. So informational texts are designed to provide us with information about a topic of interest or concern. Now, literary texts refer specifically to the type of writing that an author uses for the purpose to entertain. Another way to think about this, when we refer to informational texts, we are talking about non-fiction texts. And with literary texts, we are referring to fictional writing. So examples of literary text will be things like novels, could be a short story, maybe even a poem. So literary texts are designed to make a statement about something, or maybe to even teach a lesson. So those are the biggest key differences between the texts. Easiest way to remember it, think nonfiction for informational texts and think fiction for literary texts or literature. Now, what types of details will we find in the different types of text? In informational texts, those details are going to be factual in nature. So it could be factual statements. Or they could be historical dates. Another example would be statistics, or maybe the author is providing an example to help explain a particular idea. So the details in informational or nonfiction texts are going to focus specifically on facts. Facts that are documented and easily able to verify. In literary texts, these details are usually tied to what are known as the elements of character, or it could be the setting of the story. And finally, key details about the plot or action that is taking place. Now, we will focus more on details in literary texts later on in another unit. For our purposes this week and for the next couple of weeks, we are primarily going to be focusing on informational texts. Specifically, at least this week, we will be looking at two key types of informational text. First are what are called historical texts. Historical texts provide us with information about a particular character, or a particular person or event in history. The other type of informational text that we will be focusing on are known as science and technical texts. technical texts. Let me fix that here. Science and technical texts are designed to provide us with information about a particular topic of interest in the field of science, or maybe to provide us with information about the technical aspects of, say, for example, the Hubble Space Telescope. It could also provide us with instructions on how to perform a particular action. So again, historical texts focus on events and people from history. Science and technical texts tend to focus on information surrounding topics within the field of science or the technical aspects of a piece of machinery or something that gives us step-by-step how to complete a particular action. For our purposes today, let's begin by focusing specifically on how do we locate details in historical texts. This particular example comes from one of the lessons on IXL that you have been assigned for this week. Now, when you are answering a question in a historical text, what you want to do is focus on any details that you may find in the text of the passage or in some type of graphical information, which in this case is a table that we have presented with the text. So, let's see what the question is that we are being asked. We are told to complete the sentence. So the word antebellum means what? And we have options: before the war, after the election, before the feast, and after the long peace. So let's begin by looking at the text of the passage above. The time period in United States history between 1820 and 1861 is often called the antebellum period. During the antebellum period, the North and South became more divided. In the following questions, you will learn more about the changes that happened during the antebellum period. The following table shows other words that use the Latin root words ante and bellum. Look at the table, then complete the text below. Now, we have 3 examples under the ante column. And the first example is antecedent, something that comes before something else. The next example is antechamber, a small room that can be entered before a main room. And then the third example is anticipate, to expect or predict something before it happens. Now, if you notice in the definitions of these words, we see a repeated word. And that word is before. So, based on the information in that part of the table, we know that the word ante means before. Or the root ante means before. Now let's take a look at bellum, which we see in this column here. Belligerent, hostile or argumentative. Casus belli, cause of war. Rebel, someone who fights a government or ruler. Now, with this one, we do not have a common word, but we do see a common theme. All right? Someone who is belligerent is hostile or argumentative, or maybe somebody who fights. Casus belli is a cause of war. And rebel, someone who fights a government or ruler. Well, a war is a fight. Now, if we look at our answer choices, we can go ahead and rule out after the election, and we can rule out after the long peace, because we know that ante means before. So that leaves us with before the war and before the feast. Okay? We know that bellum has this common theme of fighting and war, so we can assume when ante and bellum are used together, the meaning specifically refers to war. Therefore, the word antebellum means before the war. Now, what war are they talking about? Well, specifically, if you look at the time period, 1820, 1861, in 1861, the Civil War began. So this antebellum period is referring to the time before the Civil War. In this example, we have a brief passage and a timeline that will provide us the information to answer the question, which of the following statements is supported by the timeline? Now, once again, details in historical texts are going to focus specifically on verifiable facts. And a timeline gives us key dates of specific time periods in, at least in this example, the time period between the Revolutionary War and the American Civil War. So the American Civil War was fought between 1861 and 1865, and we're instructed to look at the timeline of some of the major events that happened in the U.S. before the war. So which of the following statements is supported by this timeline? Our first statement is the Civil War ended with the Constitutional Convention. Well, if we look here, we see that the Civil War happened between 1861 and 1865. And then if we look down here, the Constitutional Convention took place in 1787. So the Civil War ended with the Constitutional Convention? No, because unless somebody at the end of the Civil War period had access to time travel, which is very much doubtful, there is no way that the Constitutional Convention could have taken place after the war. It took place after the Revolutionary War. The Civil War was the longest war in American history. Well, the Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865, which is approximately 5 years. The U.S.-Mexican War was from 1846 to 1848, which was approximately 2 years. Now, if you notice, the Revolutionary War was from 1775 to 1783. Now, that was for almost 8 years. So based on the information presented in the timeline, the Civil War was not the longest war in American history. So that statement is not correct. A person could have been a child in both the American Revolution and Civil War. Well, once again, 1775 to 1783 for the Revolutionary War, 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War. That is a period of almost 100 years. Now, I do not know of anyone who has ever been a child for 100 or more years. So we know this statement cannot be true. Someone born during the U.S.-Mexican War could have been alive during the Civil War. Process of elimination tells us that yes, that is true, but let's look at the timeline. The U.S.-Mexican War took place between 1846 and 1848. So if somebody was born during that time frame, it is likely that that person could still be alive between 1861 and 1865. So, our last statement is supported by the details presented in the timeline. In our final example, we are provided information from 2 maps and a brief reading passage above the maps. Let's take a look at the passage. The issue of slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. During the antebellum period, free states banned slavery and slave states allowed slavery. The maps below show the population of enslaved people at 2 different points in U.S. history. The first map shows the United States in 1800. The second map shows the United States in 1860. The year before the Civil War began. Look at the maps, then follow the instructions below. Here, we are asked to identify any errors that are in the text and to correct them. Let's take a look at the text. Between 1790 and 1800, the number of free states decreased and the number of slave states increased. In 1800, there were more slave states in only the North. By 1860, all the slave states were in the North. So our first statement that we need to look at to correct is between 1790 and 1800, the number of free states decreased. While the maps provide us with information in 1800, let's think about what was going on in 1790. This was the period after the Civil War, after the Revolutionary War. And the 13 colonies became the 13 states. So these states were the ones that were bordering the Atlantic Ocean, for the most part. Now, based on the text and the information that we are given, we see that the map provides us with the enslaved people per square mile, so we can see that there are enslaved people in most of the original colonies. Plus, we also see that there are some enslaved people in what became known as the Western Territories. These Western Territories, of course, later became states. For example, we see Kentucky right here. Kentucky was not one of the original colonies, but yet the entire state of Kentucky, we can see, is a slave state. We also see some territories up here that do not have enslaved people. So they are free states. So between 1790 and 1800, the number of free states increased. Now, earlier when we went over this in the Google Meet, we missed this piece of information. And realized that we did not consider the Western Territories. So the number of free states increased, and the number of slave states, here we see that it says it increased. And again, when we consider the Western Territories, slavery spread into some of those. So the slave states also increased. Let's look at the next sentence. In 1800, there were slave states in only the North. Now, is that true? Obviously not. The northern states, of course, are here. We see that we have New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Connecticut, all considered northern states, and they have enslaved people. But what about the southern states? We see that there's a high concentration of enslaved people in Virginia, for example, which is a southern state. So there were slave states in both the North and the South. By 1860, all the slave states were in the North. Well, if you notice in our map key for 1860, if the color is white, that means there are no slaves in those areas. If you look closely, almost the entire North, or pretty much the entire North, is free. There are no enslaved people. All of the slave states, entire states that still allowed slavery, were found in the southern states. So all slave states in the North? No, they were in the South. For this week, you are going to be focusing specifically on 3 different assignments. First, using evidence, primary and secondary sources. This is one specific IXL skill. And if you have not already completed this with a score of 80 or higher, please go ahead and do that skill. And then in the top right-hand corner of your assignment page, you will see a blue button that says Mark as done. You will click that button. Now, if you have already completed the identify primary and secondary sources, go ahead and click Mark as done, and then you can work on the other 2 assignments. Using evidence, historical texts includes the following IXL skills. And using evidence, science, and technical texts includes 3 IXL skills. So you should have a total of 10 IXLs to complete. Now, if you do not get them completed, but I see that you have still put in 10 hours worth of work, because IXL will show me how many hours that you've spent on your assignments. As far as I'm concerned, you have completed the required work. So don't get frustrated if for some reason you don't get through all of the IXL skills. I'm mostly looking to make sure that you are at least consistently going in and working on these assignments. If you want to allot a couple hours a day, Monday through Friday, you can do that. If you want to just wait and do all of it over the weekend, you can do that. As long as you have the assignment completed by Sunday night at 11:59 p.m., and by completed, I mean that you've done all of the IXLs, or you have put in 10 hours of work and it's verified on IXL, then you have participated and completed in these assignments. Now, if you do get stuck, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. You can shoot me an email. You can call me in the office. You can comment on Google Classroom. I have also in Gmail set up a chat group, a chat room specifically for this class. And if you use that, it will actually notify me on my phone. So especially if it's after normal business hours, that will be a good way to reach me. So that's all we have for today. I will be back on Google Meet on Thursday at 9 a.m. Would love to see you there, and we will be working through identifying details and evidence in science and technical texts on Thursday. If you need to schedule one-on-one time or need to schedule a Google Meet with me outside of that 9 o'clock time frame on Thursday, please let me know. Thank you, and I will see you Thursday.